This conference is to be held in Richmond, Virginia. What makes Richmond, Virginia attractive as a venue? And in particular, what makes Virginia Union University attractive?
Well, I actually love that Braxton Institute is in this part of the world because, first of all, there's a profound national history here that's related to war, that's related to a strong military presence and the federal government. And I think that there's probably quite a lot of moral injury in the geographical region of Richmond. And Richmond Union has this commitment to has a component of its life as an academic institution committed to training ministers. And I think that's very, very important. And it's important that it's in this part of the United States.
This seminary, the School of Theology at Virginia Union University, or the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, as it's sometimes known, is a historically Black university. You've done several soul repair on the road conferences, but to date, none of them has been at an HBCU. What are some of the implications of doing this work at a Black university, and how might this conference be unique?
Okay, I think that's a wonderful question, because I do think, first of all, that there's a long history of slavery in the United States that has, I think, never been adequately understood. And the conversations around race in the United States tend to be highly polarized, and they tend to be focused around blaming people for things and punishing people for things. And I think that that attitude about the horrible things that people are capable of doing make it impossible for them to actually talk about them. So I'm interested in what kind of possibilities there are using the lens of moral injury to face into the kind of history in this country around race that is still being manifested in places like Ferguson and in many other places in our country. And so to have a moral injury conference that looks at not just moral injury in the military and veterans, but also in our national consciousness, I think that's a really, really important piece, because we have never recovered from the Civil War. We are still living with the consequences of that war. I live in Texas. I have relatives in Mississippi. The Civil War and all the resentments and hurts and pains around that, and I think an unspoken sense of failure and culpability that's just never been addressed. I recently was thinking about how after World War II, there was this whole amazing confessing church movement. It was a resistance to Nazism that came out of that war, and but the moral universe of Christianity collapsed after World War II in Europe. But there was a man who was in the German Air Force who wasn't religious at all, who was a prisoner of war after World War II, British prisoner. He was a prisoner of the British, who almost killed himself as a prisoner of war because he was so upset and humiliated as a German by what his country had done. It just devastated him what his country had done. And he got interested in Christianity, and studied with the people in the confessing church movement, and became one of the most important theologians in the second half of the 20th century in Christianity, because he had to construct a form of Christianity that helped him understand his role as a German as a pilot. And so it was a really important project that so many Germans after the war, so many Europeans after the war had to do. And I think the thing that was amazing was that they did it by taking account of what had happened rather than trying to pretend it didn't happen. And in fact, this man's name was Jürgen Moltmann, and he was critical of all the German Christians who were trying to patch the old Christianity back together that had been part of the Third Reich. He didn't want that, and so he worked on it himself. So I think we have never as a country done that in face of the history of slavery and the Civil War in the United States. We have not really faced into what it means to rebuild a nation out of that kind of division and that kind of loss. And so I think that that's an interesting question to try, because we live with it today. It's not like we got over it. We're still living with the legacy of horrible forms of racism in this country, and I think it shows up in all kinds of ways. Not just in things like Ferguson, but in the people on the border trying to shoot Mexicans crossing the border and things like that. That there's just this incredible wanting to demonize people rather than humanize them. And I think that that's a thing we need to have greater conversations about in ways that aren't directed at demonizing the bad people. I mean, it's a tendency for the people who think they aren't racist to then be really angry at and demonize the racists, and I think that that's not helpful as part of the conversation. So we have to find other ways to talk about this that give people space to process. And I think being here in this part of the world with the kind of legacy that's in the soil, it's in the very world, it's in the tree, it's in this place, is a good place to be trying to do this work. And one more point is that there's a disproportionate number of people of color serving in the military and being asked to execute wars that benefit people they don't belong to, who are willing to use them. As people, you know, as Muhammad Ali said, I'm not going over there to kill Asian people who didn't do anything to me to defend these white people who have been racist and hurt my people. And that was his attitude about not being willing to go to Vietnam. And I think that we have not faced into the fact that when we ask people to go into military service in a volunteer army, that means that those who are poor and who want an education and want things that they can't afford, that's one of the ways they can do it. And so we have the highest percentage per capita of people serving in the military are Native American. The second highest percentage is Asian American, and then it's black. The percentage of white people serving in the military is much lower than the minorities. I think that's something we need to take a look at. And I also think the work of moral injury is for the people who are sent to execute these wars is really, really important. The value of being at Virginia Union is in its very structures and place and history. It carries forward as a remembrance the history of slavery in our country. And that is not something we should ever forget. And it also gives us a context in which to process both the progress we've made and the progress we need to make on issues of racial injustice and the kinds of moral injury that whole history has left behind in the souls of so many people in our country who can never talk about it because there's no place to process. And that so many young people of color in the face of that awful history, are willing to volunteer to serve their country and risk their lives for this country needs to be honored, and we need to take responsibility for the families that sent them and to bring them home to us and help them carry all the burdens of things they've had to do and seen on behalf of their love for their country, in spite of all of that. It's an amazing thing. And we owe them that.